A good Erev Shabbos. Once upon a time, Sharona and I were standing near the water's edge in Florida on the Gulf Coast. We were at a conference of Jewish community professionals, and somehow a local resident who was not part of our group identified me as Jewish and proceeded to tell us about his time in the Air Force, in the U.S. Air Force, when he would fly transport planes back and forth from Israel to bases in other countries. The details have faded with time, but not this guy's enthusiasm for Israel. He told us with great fervor and emotion how much he loved Israel and the people and the land, and even just walking around in Israel. And he gave us some insight into his emotion with the words that stay with me to this day. He said, "What the Lord loves, I love." I imagine myself having a conversation with this guy today, decades later, maybe a decade later, to see what he thinks and whether his clear perspective has become clouded over, as it's become very fashionable in some parts of America, particularly among Jews, to be skeptical of Israel lately. With Israelis, it's a little bit of a different story, because when you live there and vote and pay taxes and have to live with whatever happens there, I think you're allowed a dose of skepticism. But I wonder if this guy would still hold Israel so dear in his heart because the Lord loves Israel. In our parsha this week of Eikev, we read about the natural riches of Israel and the inherent attractions of the land that should be evident to anyone, and even before they start wondering whether or not they should love what the Lord loves. In 3 verses in chapter 8 of Deuteronomy, it talks about the natural treasures of the land of Israel itself. It says Israel is a good land, a land of brooks and water, of fountains and depths that spring out of the hills. Ki Hashem Elokecha meviacha el eretz tova, eretz nachlei mayim, ayanois u'sahaimos yotzim babika uvahar. In the next verse, it describes the vegetable bounty. It says it's a land of wheat and barley, with vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey. Eretz chita u'sa'era, v'gefen u'sa'ena v'rimain, eretz zeis shemen u'devash. Then it says that Israel is a land in which you will eat bread without poverty. Nothing shall be lacking in it. A land whose stones are iron, and from whose hills you can mine copper. Eretz asher loy v'miskenus toichel ba lechem, loy sechsar kolbo, eretz asher avaneha varzel, u'miharareha tachtzov nechoshes. So even though this whole section is introduced by God, your God is bringing you into this land, the whole appeal of Israel as they say, W-I-I-F-M, what's in it for me? This is a land in which you'll find an abundance of everything you want or need. It's all there for the taking, aplenty. It's like God took us to Costco. Now, the next verse, which sums all that up, really tells us how to feel and act, which is a bit of a shift from these phrases which tell us about all the natural treasures which welcome us, which await us. The next verse famously tells us of the mitzvah of thanksgiving, which we fill not only one day a year in the fall, but every single time we say a blessing after we eat, which hopefully is every day. It says, "You shall eat and be full, and thank God your God for the good land he has given you. V'achalta, v'savata, uveirachta, es Hashem Elokecha la'aretz ha'tova asher nasan lach." So, after all this, the question remains, why is it that we love Israel? Maybe an ancillary question might be, is that ever subject to change? Interesting insight from some of the commentaries. Rabbeinu Bachya was a Jew from Saragossa in Spain, which is pretty dry and hot. So he pointed out that the weather in Israel is lovely. He noted these verses that we just read and pointed out that it says Eretz, the land, 6 times. And he explained that this refers to 6 different types of climate in the world, which happens to be just what they taught us in junior high school when we studied climates. And he lived, when we studied, it was about 700 years after Rabbeinu Bachya. And he says that all the different types of climate are found somewhere in Israel. That's why they're spread out all over the world. And then the 7th mention of Israel in the verse about being grateful is a reference to Jerusalem, to Yerushalayim, which has its own special weather, a blend of all the climates in the world. its own unique and special mix. He seems to be saying that these verses are saying, come to Israel and enjoy the food, and by the way, you'll love the weather. It's like the old Israel Ministry of Tourism ads from the old days about Jaffa oranges. The Vilna Gaon is a little more spiritual in his explanation of what you'll like once you get there. He says that all the four creations of the world, four elements of creation, mineral, vegetable, animal, and human, all of them are elevated in holiness and sanctity, in Kedusha, by the land. Each of them not only exist, but exist for a special purpose of elevation and tikkun, or repair, rectification. So it's not just material wealth, but well-being for a purpose. Ramban Nachmanides notes that the brooks and fountains and well springs are their own type of bracha. There's water where it's needed in Israel, even from subterranean sources. So there's no need for rivers to provide irrigation like they have in Egypt. Later commentaries highlighted this difference. Since Egyptians depended on the Nile for their livelihood, they came to worship it as a deity, whereas we look to the heavens for rain. So that naturally trained us to incline heavenward, in other words, to the actual God, for our prayer and our thanksgiving. If you recall what we were doing before we inherited the land of Israel and conquered it and settled it, our previous job was slaves in Egypt, building storage cities for Pharaoh, Pitom and Ramses. That's what it says. We spent our years of servitude doing way back in the book of Exodus. Remember the grounding of the whole story with Joseph, even back in Genesis. He developed the plan for Pharaoh as to how to survive the 7 lean years that would follow the 7 plentiful years. All this, Kli Yakar points out, shows the difference between Israel and other lands. Egypt, for example, has an unstable agricultural situation. We're seeing that very much now all throughout the Middle East as a result of the war in Ukraine. And sometimes there's a need to store away food for lean times. Israel is not like this. It always has enough. He points out, Kli Yakar points out, that the word for storage cities, are miskanais, is the same word what we read in the verse, you'll eat your bread without poverty, lo v'miskenus tochal ba lechem. Let's understand all this better by keeping one more insight from the Parsha in mind. Parshas Eikev also describes the land of Israel in these terms. It says, it's a land that Hashem, your God, seeks out. The eyes of God, your God, are upon it from the beginning of the year to the year's end. Eretz, asher Hashem Elokecha doreshoisa tamid, einei Hashem Elokecha ba mireshis hashana ad achris shana. Got that? A land that the eyes of God, your God, are upon it from beginning of the year until the year's end. Which means that Israel is like no other place on earth. It enjoys constant divine attention all year round. Every minute. It's a supernatural existence. Which means to say that what happens in Israel does not always conform to logic and cannot always be explained in practical terms. Once we were at a Shabbos table with a guy who had graduated from West Point, the U.S. military academy, and he told us that in their battlefield tactics course, the instructor said they would not be studying the Middle East wars of 1948, 56, 1967, or 1973 in depth because, as he explained, you cannot learn anything practicable from those wars. Meaning that military science cannot explain Israel's victories. There's something beyond, something more, something that we can't grasp. It has been and continues to be challenging times in Israel. The political thermometer seems like it's also a symptom of global warming. It's way too warm for anyone's comfort, and it even feels dangerous. On the one hand, we appreciate and support anyone's and everyone's right peaceably to assemble and demonstrate for what they feel is right. At the same time, we look beyond the crises of the immediate moment and appreciate that we are part of the arc of a much larger story, a much grander narrative. The history of our people in the land where the eyes of God are upon it from the beginning of the year until the end of the year take on a transcendent dimension far beyond newspaper headlines. This year is a year of Hakel, of gathering, the year after the Shemitah year. By rights, if we were all there in Israel where we're supposed to be, and the temple were standing as it's supposed to be, we would be gathering together in Jerusalem, all of us, men, women, and children, to hear the Torah read publicly and to celebrate the event and the unity of the Jewish people together. The Jewish people have a great imagination, and it serves us well. When times are challenging, perhaps events seeming out of our control or even out of control altogether, we can go to a better place in our minds and hearts, which means to tap into a better level of existence. Rather than taking up sides and accusing each other, think of the Jewish people together, unified, holy, humbled, joyous, and thankful. That's not really only in our imaginations, that's a level of being we just haven't figured out how to bring it into observable reality. Yet. Let us never stop trying. Good Shabbos.